There is a place in Pennsylvania where saints were born from slaughter. A place where children vanished and churches prospered. A place where the divine was manufactured from the dead. In the soft hills west of Philadelphia, where forests stretch like ancient curtains over forgotten truths, the Whitmore family carved their empire not from wood or stone, but from flesh. Relics that bless sacred altars today, those fragments of bone and preserved skin hidden in golden reliquaries across 17 churches, were not from Rome but from neighbors, from widows, from orphans. Their names were erased. Their bodies were sanctified through silence. And behind it all, a single family, pious in appearance, monstrous in purpose, perfected the art of spiritual deception. You've heard the phrase, sacred relic. But no one told you what was inside. You were never meant to ask. You were meant to kneel. This is the story they buried beneath holy stone and hymns. The macabre history of the Whitmore family, whose workshop turned corpses into miracles and churches into accomplices. What you're about to hear will not only disturb you, it will change the way you look at religion, community, and even your own history. Because their work still echoes. Some of the relics are still out there, being prayed over by men who have no idea what lies beneath the velvet and gold. You may have seen one, you may have touched one, and once you know, you cannot unknow. For the next few moments, I want you to forget what you've been taught. I want you to listen, not with belief, but with brutal curiosity. Because the truth is never handed down from pulpits, it's dug up from graves. The Whitmore family's truth was never about faith. It was about control. This is not just a story, it's an initiation into something far older, far darker, and far more real than you were ever allowed to believe. Welcome to the hidden history of power. In 1742, when Nathaniel Whitmore stepped off the ship from England, he brought no cattle, no crops, no servants. Only a box of tools and a vision forged not in scripture, but in something older, more primal. He was a craftsman by trade, a man of sharp angles and silence, settling in Chester County where forests swallowed sound and secrets thrived like mold beneath floorboards. His wife Elizabeth, pale and elegant, moved with the poise of someone trained to suppress emotion. Together, they built a timber home that sat like a chapel among the trees. By day, they crafted religious items, crosses, chalices, carved panels for altars. Churches came from miles away to commission Nathaniel's work, praising the divine inspiration in his hands. But as the orders increased, so did something else. His hunger spoke of a holy deficiency in American churches, a lack of relics, of sacred presence, of power. In the Whitmores' theology, absence became opportunity. Protestant churches had no saints, no preserved bones to draw pilgrims, no relics to stir belief into frenzy. So Nathaniel decided he would make them. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. He would make them in flesh. The first to disappear was Mary Collins, a healer and widow known for her gentle spirit. She was last seen walking past the Whitmore property during a snowstorm. No one suspected anything. No one ever did. Weeks later, a church received an ancient relic from an anonymous donor. A fragment of bone. It was said to perform miracles. Prayers answered. Illness reversed. No one questioned its origin. Why would they? It came wrapped in sanctity. But behind the veil of ritual was decomposition. Behind the choir songs, whispers of slaughter. Nathaniel told his children they were doing holy work, that these chosen souls were sanctified in service to God's will. That the relics gave churches the power they lacked. It wasn't murder, he insisted. It was alchemy. Transmutation of flesh into faith. And that's how it began, not with blood, but with purpose. Not in rebellion, but in reverence. They didn't need to hide behind darkness. They wore holiness like armor. And in a world desperate to believe, no one looked beneath the gold. By the spring of 1746, Nathaniel Whitmore's workshop had become a sanctuary of shadows. To the untrained eye, it was simply a place of craftsmanship. Tools neatly arranged, wood dust swirling in golden light, religious items stacked with care. But beneath the floorboards, In a cellar sealed with iron latches, sanctity took on another form. Bodies lay stretched upon stained tables, viscera drained into copper pans. Bone was measured, shaved, and preserved. William, the youngest child, called it the quiet work. He was 9 years old. He never flinched. His siblings had been trained in reverence, not resistance. Thomas assisted with the flensing. Sarah tracked the names. Elizabeth embroidered the pouches that would carry the remains. They didn't see victims, they saw vessels. Their father had taught them that true worship required sacrifice. Only now, the sacrifice was never theirs. One by one, individuals vanished from neighboring counties. An old preacher, blind woman known for her psalms, a mute boy who hummed while he worked the fields. They were people no one expected to return. People whose stories could be quietly closed. And in return, the Whitmores offered churches what they called gifts of providence. Small fragments, boxed in oak and lined with velvet, claimed to be the remains of martyrs from forgotten catacombs in Europe. No one verified, no one questioned. Why? Because miracles began to happen. Congregants healed after touching the bone of a supposed 3rd century child saint. Woman's tumor disappeared after praying before a relic said to belong to a Roman nun burned alive for her faith. But it wasn't Roman. It wasn't ancient. It was local, recent. Harvested, the Whitmores began receiving letters. Desperate, pleading letters from church leaders across the colonies. Can we acquire more relics? Have you anything from a female saint? When need a heart, tongue, something incorruptible? And always discreet payment followed. Nathaniel's ledgers showed names of ministers, bishops, even political figures. The holy relic trade had become a currency of influence. But with each transaction, the Whitmore children slipped further from their humanity. They no longer slept through the night. Their dreams were flooded with the eyes of the dead. Yet when dawn came, the work resumed. Because by then, it wasn't about faith. It was about control, and the Whitmores controlled the sacred itself. In the dense woods behind the Whitmore estate stood a secondary structure, unassuming, windowless, and built of thick stone. The family called it the reliquary house. Outsiders were told it was for storage. What it stored was silence, rot, and the transformation of flesh into veneration. It was here that the family conducted their most sacred rites, shielded by pine and prayer, while the wind carried no screams, only hymns. The interior was lined with hooks and iron rings. Floor sloped gently toward a drain. Shelves held jars of dried herbs and oils. Buckets filled with brine stood beside wooden molds shaped like ribs, skulls, hands. William called them divine molds. His mind was no longer a child's. At 10, he spoke in the cadences of prophecy, and he claimed he could hear which bones held the most holiness. His mother believed him. Elizabeth began consulting her youngest before choosing parts for relics. He sees what is meant for God, she wrote in her journal. They were building a private pantheon, not of saints, but of offerings. The church had taught them to revere sacrifice, so they became its priests. The cellar below the reliquary house was cooled with river stones and coated in lime. Thomas described it in his later confession as a womb of sanctity and decay. He claimed they would sometimes sit in silence after preparing a body, surrounded by incense and scripture, thanking the remains for their service. They believed this was sacred duty. The relics, once finished, were sealed in handcrafted reliquaries and labeled in Latin, giving them the illusion of ancient provenance. Femor Sancti Lucia, Manus Beati Vincentius. Names invented, stories crafted, and with each shipment power expanded. Churches prospered. Parishioners wept before what they believed were holy remains. No one asked how a small workshop in rural Pennsylvania had access to such divine artifacts. No one asked why miracles began only after the relics arrived, and that was the brilliance of it. Miracles make men blind. Faith makes them complicit. By 1750, the Whitmores were no longer artisans. They were engineers of belief. They had discovered something terrifying. If you give people hope carved in bone, They will never look at the blood that made it. By the winter of 1751, the Whitmore relics had spread across the colonies like whispers of ancient fire. Hidden inside altars, encased in glass beneath pulpits, passed hand to trembling hand by ministers who never questioned their source. And yet, beneath every miracle, beneath every healing, every answered prayer, there lay the echo of a scream. Stripped from history, denied breath, immortalized not by choice but by capture. The family had begun to speak differently behind closed doors. Less like craftsmen, more like prophets. Nathaniel now referred to their work as a second scripture. One written not in ink, but in marrow. Elizabeth believed herself to be chosen, claiming that an angel visited her in dreams, showing her which bodies would yield the most sacred parts. She kept a red book beside her bed, recording names, dates, and what each soul was meant to become. A heart to bring compassion, tongue for prophecy, a finger bone to guide healing. It was a grotesque form of spiritual taxonomy. But it wasn't madness. It was strategy. Each relic was assigned a story, crafted carefully, referencing obscure saints from Eastern Europe or the Holy Land. They invented entire lineages to give their creations legitimacy. Letters were forged, church documents manipulated. The Whitmores were no longer just providing relics. They were rewriting religious history. And the more elaborate the lie, the more eagerly it was believed. Thomas, the eldest, began to struggle. In his later writings, he described the slow erosion of his soul. "We never looked them in the eye," he wrote. That was Father's rule. You cannot sanctify what you humanize. But William had no such struggle. At 12, he began suggesting new methods. Chemical treatments that halted decay longer, ways to give the flesh a porcelain glow. Took pride in his work. "I make them immortal," he said once, smiling. In 1752, the family received a commission from a wealthy church in Virginia. They wanted a full reliquary, containing what they believed to be the preserved remains of a Roman martyr, age 14. The request included payment, a formal letter of secrecy, and a threat. "If we are deceived, God help you." That martyr's remains were taken from a Quaker girl who had died 2 weeks prior in a poorhouse fire. She was never buried. She was transformed. And with that, the Whitmores crossed a threshold. No longer simply providers of relics, but inventors of saints. The Whitmores had discovered something darker than murder. Something more seductive than faith. They had learned to manufacture divinity. By 1753, their operation was no longer hidden in plain sight. It was camouflaged by reverence. Churches they supplied didn't just receive relics. They received stories, visions, fragments of ancient sainthood that aligned perfectly with their sermons, needs, and power structures. It wasn't a business. It was a system of belief engineered from the ground up. And every piece of bone, every preserved eyelid or heart fragment, came with a myth. These myths were designed to manipulate. Elizabeth crafted them with surgical precision, the story of a nun who resisted a Roman general and was burned alive, her tongue miraculously preserved. The legend of a child who sang hymns while buried alive in Carthage, his heart never decomposing. Each tale reinforced obedience, sacrifice, silence, and above all, faith in hierarchy. The churches ate them up. Ministers preached these myths as divine truth. Congregants wept at the altars. Donations tripled. And through it all, the Whitmores profited, not just in wealth, but in something far greater influence. They had created a religious black market where truth was irrelevant and belief was currency. And they controlled the mint. But power has a cost. In early 1754, an Episcopal bishop in New Jersey began asking questions. He wanted to verify the provenance of a relic, a femur said to belong to a 2nd-century desert monk. He wrote to European archivists. The names didn't match. The documents were false. He wrote again. This time, the response never arrived. His carriage overturned on a rainy bridge en route to deliver his findings. His driver survived. He did not. And his correspondence burned in the wreck. Was it coincidence? The Whitmores claimed no knowledge. But Sarah had recorded the bishop's name in her red ledger 2 weeks before his death. Next to it, silenced, justice through God's hand. They no longer feared being discovered, because by now they had allies, churchmen, politicians, merchants, who owed their influence to relics that only the Whitmores could provide. These weren't just customers. They were believers. And believers don't expose the source of their miracles, protect it, even if that source is soaked in blood. What the Whitmores understood, better than any theologian, better than any bishop, was this: people don't worship God. They worship symbols, and if you control the symbols, you control the soul. By 1756, their relics were no longer simply bone fragments. They were instruments of psychological control. Each piece was strategically distributed to churches experiencing decline, leadership crisis, or spiritual unrest. And every time a relic arrived, attendance soared. Miracles multiplied. Dissent quieted. These weren't coincidences. They were engineered awakenings. Thomas later revealed that the family began choosing victims, not just for their piety, but for symbolic resonance. A blind woman's eyes became a relic for churches praying for spiritual vision. A mute child's preserved tongue was sent to a congregation torn by conflict as a gift of unity. A woman burned in a house fire was passed off as a martyr from Constantinople, her blackened ribs enshrined beneath crystal glass. The effect was transformative and addictive. Churches became dependent. Ministers wrote begging letters, offering political favors, land access, even protection from future scrutiny. Some knew the relics weren't ancient. Some suspected the truth, but none cared, because the relics worked, or rather they believed they did, and belief, the Whitmores knew, is the most dangerous chemical ever created. It turned suspicion into loyalty, guilt into reverence, sin into salvation. Nathaniel began referring to the operation as the ministry. Not a family business, not a workshop, a spiritual dominion. We do what God will not, he said to his children. We bring his presence to earth. Through us he is made real. Elizabeth, meanwhile, created a ledger mapping churches by psychological profile. Those most vulnerable to relic-based control. Desperation breeds devotion, she wrote, and devotion blinds the eyes. They had shifted from craftsmen to curators of mass belief, not only shaping personal faith, but guiding institutional obedience. But there was one problem they had not yet solved. A relic could inspire belief, but belief fades. Miracles lose their heat, or becomes ordinary, and so the Whitmores needed more fresh material, rarer stories, younger saints, and Nathaniel knew where to find them among the forgotten, the orphaned, the invisible, because in a system built on silence, no one hears the cries of those already erased, and those are the perfect saints. The shift was subtle at first. A few letters requesting relics of younger martyrs, saints who died in innocence. Then came the commissions: heart tissue from a child who suffered silently, bones from a boy unmoved by torture, eyes from a girl who wept only for others. By 1760, Whitmores had opened a new chapter, one that would take their operation from grotesque to unthinkable. Children, not from families, not from communities that would ask too many questions, but from the institutional shadows, poorhouses, orphan asylums, wandering camps of displaced families. They targeted those no one tracked, no one defended. It began with a 6-year-old from a Methodist orphanage in Maryland. He disappeared during a thunderstorm. The search lasted a week. Officials blamed the weather, the terrain, wild animals. But within a month, a miraculous relic arrived at a Lutheran church in Delaware, a tiny preserved hand, perfectly formed, encased in glass and labeled Manus Sancti Innocentus, 3rd century. A child's hand held up to the altar. Believers knelt, wept, prayed. That church experienced its first revival in years. The relic became legend. The boy was never mentioned again. Thomas Whitmore would later write, there was a weight to the smaller ones, a silence that lingered longer. But Father said their holiness was pure, unspoiled. William had no hesitation. He became the architect of this new phase. refining preservation techniques to maintain the softness of skin, the clarity of a child's eye. He called it the eternal childhood. Sarah, who once recorded finances, now tracked names of the missing. She knew their birthdays, their last words, but still she wrote the labels. Still she sealed the boxes. And when doubt crept in, she prayed, asking forgiveness from the God whose name she used to justify every abomination. By 1763, 11 children had vanished across 3 counties. The disappearances were scattered, inconspicuous, explainable. But the relics, they were praised across the colonies. They were said to glow faintly in candlelight. Some swore they heard faint laughter or lullabies. In those miracles, they weren't just believed. They were bought for a price 10 times higher than any adult relic. Innocence, after all, is rare, and nothing sells faster in a corrupted world than purity you can own. You're beginning to see it, aren't you? What they were building wasn't a relic empire, it was a theology of control, designed not to save but to subdue, to feed a faith that feasted on silence. By the time the American Revolution ignited, the Whitmores had built something stronger than any colony, deeper than any creed. While armies clashed over freedom, they trafficked in reverence. As towns burned and kings fell, their relics crossed borders untouched. Smuggled beneath false altar stones, tucked into prayer books, handed from priest to politician like whispers of eternity. Chaos became their camouflage. The war disrupted trade with Europe, cutting off religious imports. Churches cried out for meaning amidst the blood. And the Whitmores answered, not with sermons but with saints. The demand for relics surged, especially those of children, especially those promising peace, healing, protection. The Lord sends us new saints, Nathaniel wrote in a letter to a minister in North Carolina. We only make their gifts last. But behind the blessings lay bones, saws, and brine. Behind every miracle, murder. Yet no one suspected them. Why would they? The Whitmores held no titles. They published no doctrine. They were not popes or generals. They were suppliers. Quiet, respectable, visible. And they had become indispensable. William, now a grown man and far more scientist than son, developed a preservation fluid he called divinum. It kept tissue soft for years, allowing him to create relics so lifelike they appeared to breathe. Eyes that glistened, lips that never cracked. The churches were entranced, and they paid dearly. But William wanted more. Not money, not influence. Legacy. He began designing what he called living relics. Fragments of preserved children placed in sealed glass shrines, surrounded by mechanisms that mimicked breath and heartbeat. They were displayed in candlelit chambers. Worshippers collapsed in ecstasy before them. Ministers claimed they could feel the pulse of God. But those pulses were not divine. They were engineered. The Whitmores had crossed into theater, manufacturing not just relics, but entire sacred experiences. They weren't just manipulating belief, they were replacing reality. And the line between miracle and machine, between holy and horrific, blurred until no one could see the difference, even the family. Especially the family. You're starting to understand now, aren't you? This was never about relics. It was about a blueprint, how to enslave a soul using awe. And once a man kneels to something he cannot verify, he becomes something he can no longer recognize. Obedient, blind, useful. There's a reason you've never heard this story. Not in history books, not in church records, not whispered through local folklore. Because the system that birthed it is still alive, still functioning, still hiding its foundations beneath sacred language and golden light. By the late 1760s, the Whitmores had embedded themselves so deeply into the fabric of early American faith that they could no longer be removed without tearing the whole cloth apart. Churches depended on them, not just for relics, but for revival, for miracles that kept congregations obedient, for holy objects that erased doubt. Ministers who questioned were replaced, critics vanished, and those who worshipped at the feet of their relics never imagined they were kneeling before embalmed children, stripped of names, sanctified by silence. Nathaniel no longer traveled, become more prophet than merchant, writing long treatises about the new covenant of flesh, in which he claimed that spiritual power must be anchored in material sacrifice. Blood is the ink of God's intention, he wrote, and he saw himself not as a murderer, but a high priest, a necessary evil in a world of fading faith. William had grown cold, detached. He spoke less and experimented more, developing a method of nerve preservation that caused relics to twitch under heat. Signs, he called them, movements of grace. Parishioners who witnessed it fell to their knees, sobbing. Elizabeth, her hair now silver, became more devout in her own way. She spent hours in the candlelit reliquary house, praying over the remains, whispering to them, calling them by the names she had assigned: Lucia, Benedictus, Innocentia. The names were never theirs, but the power was. Children remained voiceless, but their bodies spoke in miracles. Their pain, packaged in velvet and sealed in wax, built churches, built faith, built control. And if you think this ended in fire, in revelation, in judgment, you're mistaken. Because evil that wears the mask of sanctity doesn't fall, it evolves. Halfway into this descent, if you're still with me, I want you to comment below. I will never kneel to false light. Write it twice. Once for the children who were silenced, once for the man you are becoming. Let the algorithm see you. Let the world know you see behind the veil. This is the moment everything changes, and the descent only gets darker from here. By the early 1770s, the Whitmores were no longer seen as a family, but as a rumor, a legend, a shadowy force behind the sacred glow of revival. Ministers whispered of them in private, never daring to speak their name from the pulpit, yet secretly waiting for the next box. A reliquary, a preserved rib, a child's eyelid still shut in eternal prayer. These objects became more than symbols. They were weapons. They quelled rebellions in churches, restored faith in dying towns, and above all, ensured loyalty from those who handled them. Because once a man accepts holiness from a hidden hand, he becomes bound to it. Bound by guilt, by secrecy, by awe. The Whitmores didn't threaten, didn't need to. The relics themselves did the work. William's innovations had reached unsettling heights. He created what he called resonant containers. Glass chambers that amplified breath, so the faintest air movement caused relics to murmur, vibrate, or chime. Parishioners interpreted it as the voice of saints. Some claimed to hear their names called. These responsive relics became the most sought after. But only certain churches received them. Only the most obedient. Only those who offered more than coin, land, silence, allegiance. Whitmores were building an unseen hierarchy. A shadow church within the church. One that didn't preach, didn't sing, didn't repent. Only watched, only rewarded, only extracted. And the extraction wasn't just bodies. It was influence. Once a relic entered a congregation, the Whitmores began to receive letters. Confessions, gossip, secrets. People believed the relics knew they were watching. That to disobey was to offend the saint inside. So they offered everything. A bishop confessed his affair. A deacon disclosed financial crimes. A preacher in Boston offered access to a new orphanage. "We know you're the true shepherds," he wrote. "Guide us." That word, guide, appeared in more and more letters. People no longer turned to God, they turned to the relics, to the family that created them, to the myth that now controlled them. Thomas once wrote in the margins of his hidden manuscript, "We made saints and became gods. Gods built from rot can only rule the dead." He was right, but no one was ready to hear it. Not yet. Because the deeper the lie, the more sacred it feels, and the people were falling in love with the dark. There's a threshold every system of control crosses. The moment when truth is no longer dangerous, but irrelevant. By 1774, the Whitmores had passed that line, no longer feared exposure. Not because they couldn't be discovered, but because they knew no one would act, even if they were. The churches were addicted to the miracles, to the prestige, to the illusion that holiness had a price, and they had paid it. The family now operated in total secrecy, yet total impunity. The reliquary house had been expanded underground, forming catacomb-like vaults lined with stone niches, each containing labeled remains. Some were relics in progress. Others were failed experiments. Some were unspeakable. William spent more time below than above, his mind fractured by years of ritualized desecration. Stopped referring to the children as victims, or even saints. He called them resources. He kept meticulous notes. Skin elasticity, bone clarity, emotional residue. Believed fear left an imprint, one that could be harvested. He experimented with preservation during moments of terror, claiming the resulting relics produced stronger visions. And people believed it. Churches with these relics reported prophetic dreams, physical healings, speaking in tongues. None dared question where the power came from. They had seen too much, and they wanted more. Meanwhile, Sarah Whitmore, the quietest and perhaps most tormented of them all, began to keep a second journal. Not for the business, but for herself. It was never meant to be read. In it, she described the dreams, voices of the dead, the sensation of hands clutching her throat at night. She wrote, "They are not saints. They are awake, and they are angry." Still, she continued. Still, she counted the coins. Still, she labeled the bones, because guilt, when swallowed daily, becomes its own sacrament. In 1775, as war ignited between Britain and the colonies, the Whitmores expanded again. This time through proxy. Traveling ministers were paid to scout new territories, identify vulnerable congregations, deliver relics in exchange for loyalty. The system spread like disease, and no one noticed because they were too busy praying, too busy weeping before eyes that once belonged to children who died in silence. You see now, don't you? This wasn't a story, it was a template, and the world is still built on it. One miracle, one relic, one forgotten body at a time. By the bitter winter of 1776, as the colonies declared their independence from the crown, churches in America were unknowingly becoming enslaved to a far older kingdom. One built not on parchment, but on preserved flesh and whispered legends. The Whitmore system had metastasized. No longer a single operation, it had become a movement cloaked in ritual and rot. Their relics now adorned pulpits from Boston to Charleston. They had agents, loyal clergy, influential families, even military chaplains, each sworn to secrecy, each rewarded with miracles no scripture could promise. And at the center of this growing web sat Nathaniel Whitmore, now rarely seen outside his reliquary sanctum, where he would sit for hours in front of the most prized relics. Child bones polished like ivory, preserved hearts suspended in crystal, and the famed voice of Sebastian, a mummified larynx said to produce soft hymns in candlelight. That relic alone was worth more than any church's yearly tithe. But this was never about wealth, it was about obedience. Miracles are debts, Nathaniel told his inner circle. And once a man owes the sacred, he cannot revolt. While patriots spoke of liberty and tyrants, churches quietly pledged themselves to relics they would never admit were new, let alone American. The irony was exquisite. As a nation tried to free itself from an empire, spiritual foundations were being mortgaged to a family whose throne was built from corpses. Meanwhile, William's madness turned visionary, claimed to be receiving direct revelations from the relics themselves, insisting that each one held trapped consciousness, residual memory, even spiritual intelligence. He spoke to them, named them, fed them incense, light and blood. Thomas, in his prison confession, later wrote, "He, my brother, did not just preserve death, he invited it to speak." Sarah, increasingly haunted, wrote of sounds beneath the floor, scraping, faint murmurs, soft weeping. "I fear we've built a church of the damned," she penned, "and they are beginning to pray back." But none of them stopped, because by now, the machine could not be shut down without destroying the very churches it empowered. They had rewired faith itself, and to expose the source would be to destroy the altar, the sermons, the hope. So the Whitmores continued, because the truth no longer mattered. Only the relics, Only the glow. Only the silence. There's a moment every corrupt empire when the facade begins to crack. Not from force, but from within. For the Whitmores, that moment came in the spring of 1777, not with an accusation or an arrest, but with a scream. It was heard by Sarah. 3 nights in a row, echoing from the reliquary vaults beneath the earth. A child's scream, not distant, but immediate. Not memory, but presence. She rushed down the stone steps with her oil lamp trembling in her hand, convinced one of the preserved relics had been tampered with, or worse, revived. But the vault was undisturbed. Everything in its place. Everything exactly as it should be except the air. It was warm, moving, breathing, and as she turned to leave, she felt something grip her wrist. Briefly, lightly, but undeniably. The cold hand of a child. She told no one. Not at first. Because Sarah, like everyone else in that family, had become a high priest of denial. But she began writing again, not in her journal, but directly on the vault walls. Warnings. Names. Began visiting the relics alone, not to prepare them, but to apologize, to weep. I hear them, she wrote. They are not at peace. They are not saints. They are watching. William noticed the changes in her, and he grew furious. Not because she had broken protocol, but because he believed the relics should speak. You shame them with your guilt, he shouted. They are divine. You cry before gods. And he struck her. Hard. It was the first time blood was spilled in the reliquary that wasn't part of ritual. After that, something shifted. The dreams returned, to all of them. Not memories, warnings. The family began to see shadows move when no one walked. Candles blew out in sealed rooms, and several relics began to decompose, despite being perfectly preserved for years. William called it divine testing. Nathaniel said nothing, but Sarah began sealing certain niches shut with wax and salt, not for preservation, for containment. She had come to believe that their relics had become vessels, not for saints, but for something else. Something older than doctrine, older than light, and she was beginning to wonder if they hadn't built a ministry at all, but a prison, a sacred tome. And now the dead were waking up. It began with the reliquary labeled Innocentia, a child's preserved skull, nestled in violet silk, displayed beneath a glass dome in the family's inner sanctum. It had been one of their earliest, most profitable relics, said to emit warmth when prayers were whispered beside it. For nearly 20 years, it had drawn hundreds to churches in Maryland, only to be recalled to the family estate in 1776 for spiritual reconditioning, as William called it. But in the fall of 1777, it cracked. Not shattered, cracked. Down the center, perfectly clean, as if split by unseen hands. There was no external damage, no sign of mishandling, and the temperature in the vault was stable. William examined it for days. No explanation, but Sarah knew. She wrote, that was the first seal, broken not by accident, but by awareness. From that moment on, the relics began to fail. Slowly, subtly. A box that once glowed stopped glowing. A mummified tongue began to rot from the inside out. The voice of Sebastian relic stopped humming, and instead began to produce a low, guttural sound, like weeping. And every time a relic failed, the same pattern followed: dreams, nightmares, whispers. The servants, though never told what happened below, began refusing to stay past dark. One hung himself in the hayloft, another fled barefoot through the woods and was found days later, babbling about whys in the floor. William tried to salvage the process. He created new formulas. He even attempted to bless the vault using blood drawn from himself, convinced that sacrifice would appease the relics. But the miracles stopped. The money slowed. The letters from churches became more frantic, more accusatory. They demanded replacements, answers, power. Because without the relics, faith had no spectacle. And without spectacle, churches began to unravel. Ministers who had built their reputations on divine healing suddenly found themselves powerless before their flocks. Congregations left. Tithes vanished. Some turned to new movements. Others cursed the saints they once adored. And the Whitmores, once revered as silent saints of the sacred trade, were now seen, by a few, as deceivers. The irony: the relics had been real, the power had flowed, but power without consent festers, decays, bites back. Sarah stopped going below entirely. She locked her door at night, kept candles burning until dawn. She began writing names again, but not those of children. These were different, unknown, ancient. She wasn't sure if she was translating or remembering, because what they had summoned wasn't holy, and it was no longer sleeping. The final descent began not with death, but with silence, total unnatural silence. On the morning of January 3rd, 1778, every bird vanished from the trees surrounding the Whitmore estate. No wind, no snow, no movement, just stillness that pressed against the windows like a held breath. Sarah was the first to notice. She stepped outside and wrote later that it felt like standing at the bottom of a well carved from sky. That day, one of the relics liquefied. The breath of Clement, a preserved lung that had once expelled warm, fragrant air when touched. It collapsed into a black, tar-like fluid that ate through the silk it was wrapped in and cracked the marble table beneath it. William screamed when he saw it, not in fear but in rage. "Thee are ungrateful," he roared, slamming his fists into the reliquary shelf. "Thee would be nothing without us." That night, Sarah tried to run. She packed a small satchel, wrapped her journals in oiled cloth, and crept out past midnight. But she didn't make it 20 feet before she collapsed. Paralyzed, eyes wide, heartbeat racing, she was later found by Thomas, who carried her inside whispering, "You can't leave, sister. You know too much." And in that moment, Sarah understood something she had always feared but never named. None of them were free, not just from guilt, from it, the power, the force, whatever they had bound themselves to, whatever had given life to their relics. It now possessed them as much as it had the bones they worshipped. That same night, William returned to the vaults alone, took a relic, the preserved hand of child martyr Lysander, one of the most powerful, and tried to resurrect it. Not spiritually, literally. Using wires, alchemical fluids, and a crude lightning rig powered by iron rods and a rotating copper wheel, he screamed verses from Exodus and alchemical texts. He called for fire, for obedience. What answered was not Lysander. The hand twitched, the fingers bent backwards, and then it burst into flame. Black, oily fire that didn't burn upward, but downward into the stone. William fled half-mad, his face scorched, clothes soaked in the preservative fluid that dripped from the shelves. The vault remained untouched the next morning, but on its stone walls, ones that hadn't been marked in decades, new writing had appeared, not in ink, not in blood, but in soot and bone ash. A single phrase, repeated 3 times, "EYOU-ER-WARNED." The silence didn't leave the property for another week. They say the human mind breaks not at the sight of horror, but at the moment it realizes the horror was always there, waiting, watching, woven into the very things we trusted most. For Sarah Whitmore, that break came on the night of February 11th, 1778. She had returned to the reliquary vault not in ritual, but in resignation. Something inside her had shattered. She no longer believed in repentance. She no longer prayed. She only wanted to see the faces one last time. The relics, the remains, the children. But when she stepped through the iron door, the air was wrong again. Warm, pulsing, alive, and the eyes were open. Not all of them, just a few, but it was enough. Preserved heads, stored in bell jars for decades, now stared back at her, now blankly, knowingly. And in that moment, Sarah collapsed, not from fear, but from recognition. Because the face staring back, small, sunken, half-decayed, was the same one she had seen in her dreams for weeks. "Lucia," she whispered, "I remember your name now." She had named the relics out of necessity, decoration, but now they spoke their true names back to her. Names she had never been told, names she had forgotten. That night she locked herself in the highest room of the Whitmore house, boarded the windows, and burned the journals. Not the first set, those she had already hidden beneath the chapel floorboards weeks prior. These were the newer ones, the darker ones, full of things she feared the living should never read. "We invited them," she wrote in the margins of a scorched page. "Not saints, not demons, something older, something hungry." Meanwhile, William had entered a different spiral. He became obsessed with the fire that had erupted from Lysander's relic. He called it the baptism. He believed it was proof they had tapped into the true divine force beyond doctrine, beyond God. He spoke in symbols, drew sigils in the snow with salt and bone. He stopped eating. His skin turned pale, translucent. He said he could hear the relics breathing beneath the floorboards. And one night, he swore one of them spoke his name, not in threat, in welcome. "We are kin now," he whispered, smiling. Thomas, watching it all, knew better. "William isn't hearing the dead," he wrote. "He's becoming one of them." And still, the churches kept asking, kept buying, kept kneeling, because nothing silences doubt like a miracle, even if it smells like rotting flesh. By the spring of 1778, the Whitmore estate had become a sanctified mausoleum. Silent halls filled with breathing relics, family members speaking in riddles, and the constant sense that something beneath the earth had awakened. The reliquary no longer hummed with ritual. It pulsed with presence. The vaults now flickered with unnatural light, phosphorescent glows that appeared without flame, hovering above certain niches. The preserved remains no longer decayed. They changed. One relic, a fragment of spine believed to belong to a 16th century French martyr, began growing thin, hair-like filaments that moved when watched. Another, a mummified infant's heart, started beating faintly during storms. William began calling these transformations the Ascension, but Sarah called them what they were: invasions. "The flesh is not remaining what it was," she wrote. "Something is rewriting it, from the inside out." That summer, Sarah uncovered the truth William had hidden from them all. Deep within the lowest vault, past the earliest reliquary shelves, there existed a chamber even Thomas didn't know about. It was circular, carved not in the family's hand, but older, deeper, as if bored into the stone by fire and pressure, not tools. At its center stood a pedestal, and on it not a relic, not remains, but a seed, black, obsidian, pulsing, the size of a clenched fist. "I found it in 1764, William confessed when she confronted him, "in the bones of a failed relic, a twin that never formed. It spoke to me." He believed the seed was the origin of their power. Not God, not the saints, but this, a source that predated religion, preyed on reverence, and through ritual, pain, and sacrifice it fed. Every relic was a prayer, William whispered, and every prayer fertilized it. Sarah fled the chamber in silence, but something inside her fractured beyond repair. For years she had believed they were desecrating the dead to serve the living. Now she understood. They had been serving something else, something that had no name, something that had waited patiently in darkness, whispering in preserved ears, blooming in bodies repurposed for worship. Thomas, reading her account, scribbled in horror, "It wasn't death we preserved. It was gestation." And in that line, the true horror of the Whitmore legacy came into focus. They hadn't built a reliquary. They had built a womb, a place where belief, blood, and silence combined to incubate something other. And now it was almost ready, almost born, almost seen. By late summer of 1778, the Whitmore estate had become a site of convergence, where faith, flesh, and forbidden force collapsed into a singular, pulsing insanity. The reliquary vaults no longer needed light. The walls themselves had begun to emit a dull glow, faint and green, if the stone had absorbed decades of whispered prayers and exhaled them back in spectral breaths. Even the air changed, thicker, metallic. Breathing became labor. The servants were gone, fled or dead. Family no longer slept. Not truly. Dreams overtook their waking hours. Sarah wandered the halls murmuring names in dead languages she couldn't read. Thomas scratched prayers into the wood of his desk until his fingernails bled. William, what remained of him? no longer wore shoes or spoke incoherent sentences. He had taken to kneeling for hours at the mouth of the lowest chamber, whispering to the seed. "It's almost time," he would say. "Almost time to crown." And yet, the outside world still came knocking. Ministers' buyers. Desperate men seeking miracles to restore order in a nation unraveling after war. They brought gold, they brought names. And the family gave them what they wanted. More relics, more fragments of the divine. All the while knowing the power now poured through them, not from sanctity, but from something that had never known light. One day, a minister from Maryland arrived unannounced, demanding an audience. Reverend Josiah Hale, known for fierce sermons and a reputation for uncovering false prophets, had heard whispers of children, of relics that bled, of saints too fresh to be ancient. Was not a man easily deceived. He requested a tour. Thomas reluctantly agreed. But before Hale could descend into the true vault, he collapsed. Seizure, bleeding from the nose. He muttered in Latin, then in something no one recognized. When he awoke hours later, he fled without a word, leaving behind his Bible and his ring. Sarah picked it up and saw it was etched not with scripture, but with a phrase she had seen only once before burned into the reliquary stone. They were never asleep. From that moment on, Sarah knew what had to be done. The seed could not be contained. The relics could not be sanctified. The reliquary had become an altar for a God that did not forgive. She began writing letters, preparing evidence, gathering the names of every church that had accepted a relic. And finally, she wrote the first and only line in her final journal. Bury the light before it births the dark. It was Sarah who initiated the final betrayal. Not to punish her family, but to stop what she knew they were too far gone to resist. She disguised her intentions behind quiet repentance, resumed her attendance at evening prayers, and even assisted William with a new batch of relics. 3 finger bones, a child's rib, a section of preserved scalp still bearing strands of golden hair. But beneath her calm demeanor, she had already sent the letters. 32 of them. One to each church they had supplied over the years, another to Elijah Thompson in Philadelphia, and one, most importantly, to a man whose name no one in her family ever spoke aloud, Father Elias Brandt, a Jesuit scholar once exiled from Rome for publishing theories on relic corruption, demonic vectors, and sacramental inversion. Sarah had read his banned manuscripts in secret during her youth. She now believed he was the only man who could destroy what they had become. Within a week of the letters being sent, 3 of them were intercepted. Sarah knew this because William confronted her in the reliquary, his hands shaking, eyes wide with betrayal, and something far worse of fear. "Do you know what you've done?" he hissed. "You've made it hungry. It feels the threat. It knows." And then he collapsed, convulsing, blood running from his ears. He spoke in a voice that was not his own, a deep, humming language that vibrated the walls. Thomas tried to restrain him, but it was no use. Something had already entered. Sarah spent the next 3 days in the attic chapel, fasting, praying, burning her hands on candles as a form of penance. But she knew it wasn't enough. On the 3rd night, the seed cracked, not with sound, with pressure, like the whole house leaned toward it. The vault's doors bent inward. Stones wept a clear fluid that hissed against iron. Sarah, standing above, felt the pulse through the floorboards. The relic sang, not with music, but with memory. Every voice, every scream, every final breath ever preserved began to echo through the house. William disappeared, his bed untouched, the sigils he'd painted on the walls all scorched black. Sarah wrote one final no-take. "It's not coming. It's arriving through us, through the saints we stole, through the silence we worshipped. I can feel it in my bones now. I think I was always part of it." Elijah Thompson received Sarah's letter on the morning of September 6, 1778, arrived in a bundle of correspondence from distant Quaker congregations, wrapped in waxed linen, sealed with no family crest, but bearing a familiar smell, myrrh, and something beneath it, salt. cop and old wood. The letter was unlike anything he had ever read. Calm, methodical, and terrifying in its precision. Sarah didn't beg. She documented. Detailed names, dates, materials, buyers. She mapped the locations of churches that unknowingly worshipped atop processed flesh. She described the seed, the relic transformations, the voices from the vault, and her fear that what they had believed to be divine was something far older and more predatory. "We do not sanctify the dead," she wrote. "We invite the ancient." Thompson, still weakened from his earlier poisoning, read the letter 4 times before rising to dress. He summoned his most trusted contacts in Philadelphia, including a Jesuit exile who now operated under a false name and a backroom apothecary. That man, Elias Brandt, read Sarah's testimony and grew visibly pale. "It's not a relic vault," he said. "It's a threshold." The two men immediately began coordinating an unholy alliance, Quaker rationalism and forbidden Catholic esoterica. Their mission was not merely to expose the Whitmore family, but to seal whatever had been allowed to gestate beneath their land. By September 10th, they were en route to Chester County with 2 carts, 5 trusted men, and a collection of outlawed ecclesiastical tools, crucibles, salt circle vessels, sanctified iron stakes, relic binders, and a single tome. One Brandt claimed had been buried in the catacombs beneath Marseille. "You must understand," Brandt whispered to Thompson as the horses rolled into the mist-covered hills. "This is not about stopping them. This is about stopping it. The family is just the skin it wears." As they approached the estate, the land itself seemed to recoil. Trees bent unnaturally away from the property. The wind shifted direction each hour. Birds flew in jagged patterns overhead, never daring to perch on the house or the chapel. That night, they camped 2 miles out. None of the men slept. The air was too thick, the silence too heavy.